And now, once again, I'm going to call on Dr. Jim Chris to give us the introduction for the afternoon session.
Thank you for that excessively brief introduction, Jeff. I was not quite ready. I had to inhale and exhale. Obviously, from some of the ambiguity and irony and uncertainty that we talked about before with regard to the definition of words and perhaps even to what was going on in Texas during this critical period, there is this period between certainly the 30s, maybe even as early as the 20s, and the 1840s, in which Texas is a zone of uncertainty. Who's in charge? What's going to happen to this place? What language are they going to speak? What legal system are they going to be governed by? What's the future of Texas? Especially what's the future of Texas once the elbowing and the struggle between 1830 and 1835 occur, and then certainly in the aftermath that we've heard about in the Republic of Texas period. Our afternoon speakers today are going to talk about what happens to individuals and what happens to institutions in that zone of uncertainty that Texas represents between the 1830s and the 1820s and the 1840s. They will show us how situations occur where both danger and opportunity are rife. Specifically, as Madge Roberts talks about Sam Houston and Mike Campbell talks about the institution of slavery, both for the individual and the institution. There are in this time of uncertainty and in this zone of uncertainty both dangers and also opportunities. Our first speaker this afternoon will be Madge Roberts, who grew up here in Houston, attended Lamar High School, graduated from Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, took her master's degree at Trinity in San Antonio, and then for 38 years was an elementary school teacher in San Antonio before she retired and began her second complete career, and that is as a writer and speaker on Texas history with particular emphasis on her great, how many, Madge? Both greats, grandfather Sam Houston. Madge has written prize-winning books of her own. Her Star of Destiny, The Private Life of Sam and Margaret Houston, was awarded the Otis Locke Award by the East Texas Historical Association. Madge, by the way, will be speaking on this book here in Houston at the Heritage Society on Wednesday, May 7th. And you should call the Heritage Society to find out what Madge doesn't know, and that is when she may be speaking on Wednesday, May 7th. But she will be doing that for sure. She's also edited a collection which I've found extraordinarily useful, 4 volumes now of the correspondence between Sam Houston and his wife Margaret. Is it the entire? Are all the letters back and forth between others as well? But some of the most interesting are those between Sam Houston and Margaret Lee Houston, but other letters as well, including some key information on what might have happened to that young woman named Emily on the San Jacinto battlefield on April 21st. That set of correspondence, Volume 1, received the T.R. Fehrenbach Award given by the Texas Historical Commission. We're running a little bit late. Madge, I have several pages more for this introduction, but I'm going to let you begin. Please welcome Madge Roberts. One more thing. Turn off your cell phones now.
And if I haven't got the microphone in the right place, somebody tell me. Controversy will always reign on Houston's reasons for coming to Texas and his activities during the Texas Revolution. Historians and authors either detest him or admire him, and their writings reflect their opinions. Some historians write about him with undocumented sources. When I speak on Houston, I use primary sources for the best possible documentation, mainly his own personal correspondence. Letters to his wife and friends give his opinions of historical events and people involved and explain his actions. Unfortunately, most of this correspondence begins after the Texas Revolution, and Houston seldom wrote of the events. So I used other primary sources. Papers of those who knew Houston and authors he cooperated with: William Fairfax Gray, Thomas Rusk, Francis Lubbock. Houston wrote Margaret that he was so impressed with historian William Kennedy that he had placed in his hands papers never before made public, and gave him his prophecies about the Alamo and Goliad. Henderson Yoakum wrote his history of Texas in Houston's law office with complete access to Houston's papers. C. Edwards Lester said he prepared a minute account of Texas history with the constant cooperation of Houston. The family cooperated with historians whose works I respect, and there were books in family papers by his son Andrew. These are the sources for today's talk. Historian Reuben Potter, a San Jacinto veteran, gave me my focus. Of his own work, he said, "If we owe departed heroes the duty of preserving their deeds from oblivion, we ought to feel just as strongly that of defending their memory against the calumnious effects of false eulogy, which in time might cause their real achievements to be doubted. I will attempt today to give you no false eulogies." A protege of Andrew Jackson, Houston reached the pinnacle of success, a military hero, congressman, and governor of Tennessee, and was mentioned as a future presidential candidate. Then came a failed marriage and exile with the Cherokees in Arkansas. Here he became known as the Big Drunk and sank to deepest despair. Enemies circulated rumors that Houston was a secret War Department agent organizing an illegal enterprise with the Cherokees to conquer Texas and set himself up as emperor. Yoakum wrote that Houston had been furnished with secret instructions to induce the Indians who had come to Texas from the U.S. to return. President Jackson wrote Houston that he did not believe the stories, but Houston's pledge of honor to the contrary would guarantee no injuries to his country or to Houston's fame. Historians credit Jackson with rescuing Houston's career. While he certainly contributed, some family members have a different theory about the change in Houston's life that brought him to Texas. In August of 1831, he rushed to his dying mother's bedside in Tennessee. Almost 20 years earlier, his mother had signed papers for the underage Sam to join the army to serve in the War of 1812. She gave him a musket with instructions never to bring disgrace to the family's name, saying, "I would rather that all my sons to fill one honorable grave than one should turn his back to save his life. Although the door to my cabin is always open to brave men, it is eternally closed to cowards." She also gave him a ring engraved with the word honor, which he wore for the rest of his life and which is displayed at the San Jacinto Museum. Houston later wrote his wife of that visit and how his mother gave him her blessing from her deathbed. No other record exists of their conversation, but it caused him to take stock of his life. After her death, a change came over him. He later said that he left Tennessee with a will to reestablish himself as a mark of respect in her memory. He returned to Arkansas, sat with the Cherokee National Council, and by December was on his way to Washington with a plan. He'd received a letter from an old friend saying Texas was a fine field for enterprise. He could get a grant of land, be surrounded by friends, and what might the coming of time bring? Houston traveled east to meet with financier James Prentice and discuss buying land in Texas to be bought in bulk and sold off in parcels for profit. When the deal fell through, he left to visit Jackson. It's possible that Jackson did lend him $500 to come to Texas. Jackson did request that a passport be issued to him on August 6, 1832, asking that all tribes of Indians in amity with the United States, are yet not allied to them by treaties, to permit Houston to pass freely through their territory and to give him all lawful aid and help. This gave rise to the assumption that Houston went to Texas as a government representative of Jackson's personal messenger to promote a revolution. But Houston was still in Nashville when unhappy settlers called delegates from all over Texas for their first political meeting in St. Philippi. And Houston's mind was still on Tennessee politics. As he was entering Texas, he wrote his cousin that his trip to Texas was important to his financial status. I am about to enter Texas, health and spirits both good, habits sober, and my head straight. Friends have announced my name for the next governor of Tennessee and are sure of my success. I do not doubt it if I should run, as I think I shall. I must be back by the 1st of April. It would appear that he didn't plan to stay in Texas long enough to start and organize a revolution. Houston crossed the Red River on December 10th, riding into Nacogdoches with two objects. First, acting as a confidential U.S. agent looking into dispensation for the Indian tribes and examining the value to the U.S. should they decide to purchase it. And second, as an agent, as claimant for land. In his memoirs, Houston wrote that one look at Texas and the situation of the people was enough to convince him that this was the place for him. That the next Texas convention was scheduled in just 3 months was just a favorable coincidence. Houston rode on to San Felipe to seek a land grant from Stephen F. Austin, where he met old friend Jim Bowie. Austin was away, so Bowie and Houston rode to San Antonio. In the Comanche territory beyond San Antonio, Houston met with the chiefs, obtained their promise to attend a meeting at Fort Gibson with other tribes and the Indian commissioner, and presented them with the medal of Jackson's likeness. He returned to San Felipe, met with Austin, and purchased a tract of 4,000 acres of land on Caracawa Bay. By December 24, 1832, Houston was a Texas landowner. He stopped in Nacogdoches, where friends put his name up as a delegate for April 1st convention in San Felipe. He wrote Jackson, "I am in possession of some information that will doubtless be interesting to you and may be calculated to forward your views if you should entertain it touching the acquisition of Texas by the government of the U.S. The colonists are now without laws to protect them. Mexico is involved in a civil war. The federal Constitution has never been in operation." He made this prediction. The people of Texas are determined to form a state government and separate from Coahuila. And unless Mexico is soon restored to order and the Constitution revived, the province of Texas will remain separate from the Confederacy of Mexico. My opinion is that Texas will, by her members in convention by the 1st of April, declare all that country north of the Rio Grande as Texas proper and form a state constitution. He added, Texas is the finest country to its extent upon the globe. I may make Texas my abiding place. In adopting this course, I will never forget the country of my birth. Here he established a law practice saying that he took up residence among new constituents who had extended him so generous a greeting. At San Felipe, he supported an old friend, William Horton, against Austin for presiding officer. Houston was elected chairman of the committee to frame the Constitution of the separate state of Texas. The members voted 3 men be sent to Mexico City to present the petition for statehood. Houston discovered that Austin's enemies intended to exclude him from the mission, and he felt that without him there was no hope for success. He said, I gave Austin my sincere and cordial support, and Austin was one of the men elected. Before Austin left, he and Houston had a confidential meeting. Houston reported, I assured him that if he succeeded in obtaining state government, that I would never oppose him in any civil office in the state, but grant him my cordial support thereafter. This I was induced to do because he was aware that I had not supported him for the presidency of the convention. And while he was absent, he might suppose that I would countenance a treaty against him, which I had resolved not to do, but to support and sustain him in his absence. Houston rode to Comanche County again to remind the chiefs of the conference in Arkansas. However, when he reached the fort a month later, neither the Indians nor the commissioner appeared. Still suffering from the shoulder wound he had received at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Houston sought medical attention at the hot springs in Arkansas and wrote his cousin, I am a resident of another government and in a few days expect to return to Nacogdoches in Texas, where I'm now located. You will want to know what the devil am I going to do in Texas. I will practice law and with excellent prospects. Texas is the finest portion of the globe that has ever blessed my vision. Houston did extensive research on Texas land laws. He was admitted to practice law in Nacogdoches in John Juan Mora's court. While Houston was building his law practice, the people of Texas were waiting for Austin to return. Santa Anna seized power of the Mexican government. Texas's petition was denied and Austin imprisoned. Texan liberals were disturbed. Austin wrote urging restraint and asking the colonists to keep quiet and discontinue revolutionary methods. Houston shared Austin's counsel and comments, believing that ultra-liberals would plunge Texas into a conflict with Mexico before she was ready for it. Austin's arrest finally had a calming effect on the colonists. No one wanted their rash acts to cause his suffering or death. During this calm, Houston advised Prentiss of the situation in Texas. On April 24, 1834, he wrote, I do not think it will be acquired by the U.S. I do think that within 1 year it will be a sovereign state of Mexico. And acting in all things as such, I think that in 3 years it will be separated from the Mexican Confederacy and remain so forever. I have written to you just my opinions on the course of what things must and will take in Texas. She cannot and will not remain as she is now. Keep my predictions and see how far they are verified. Texas will be bound to do for herself. This present year must produce events important to her future destiny. I think greatly beneficial to her prosperity. I deprecate the necessity, however fateful the result may be for her. Still, if Mexico had done right, we could have traveled on smoothly enough. He stated his own position. Many suppose a peace offer by us, but such a course that I may pursue shall be for the true interest of Texas, and if it can be done as it ought to be, to preserve her integrity to the Confederacy of Mexico. In Nacogdoches, he became a Mexican citizen, filing a certificate of character required of all aliens on April the 21st, 1835. Signed by Juan Dora, it stated that this is to certify that foreigner Samuel Pablo Houston is a man of good character, loving the Constitution and laws of the country of Mexico, and generally known as a good man. He now engaged in private pursuits, building his law practice and seeking land that could be bought at the cheapest prices. Meanwhile, events transpired in Mexico that would eventually verify Houston's predictions. President Santa Anna fancied himself head of the army, putting down his orders and consolidating his powers. He dispersed Congress and convened a new one composed of his loyal followers. The Constitution of 1824 was nullified, giving Santa Anna the power of absolute monarch. In May, when the state of Zacatecas resisted, one of the bloodiest massacres in the Western Hemisphere resulted. Texas was the next trouble spot. Santa Anna made plans to force the colonists back to the U.S. or to be exterminated. He placed General Martin Perfecto de Cos in command of the northeastern provinces, including Coahuila and Tejas. Santa Anna's plans became apparent in June when one of Cos's couriers was captured, and this letter fell into Texians' hands. In a very short time, the affairs of Texas will be definitely settled, for which purpose the government has ordered to take up the line of march a strong division composed of the troops which were in Zacatecas. These Texian revolutionists will be ground down. Austin was finally released and reached Texas in September. During imprisonment, his views changed as Santa Anna rose to power. The peacemaker now believed the time for action had come, but that the people should decide. A consultation was called to convene on November the 1st. In Nacogdoches, the Committee for Vigilance and Safety appointed Houston Commander-in-Chief of the department's military forces and authorized him to raise and organize troops, issue proclamations, and sustain the principles of the Constitution of 1824. He immediately sent a letter to Isaac Parker in the U.S. saying that war in defense of our rights, our oaths, and our constitutions was inevitable in Texas, and offering bountiful land grants to volunteers. In his general orders to the troops in Nacogdoches on October 8, 1835, he wrote, "The time has arrived when the revolutions in the interior of Mexico have resulted in the creation of a dictator. Mexico and Texas is compelled to assume an attitude defensive of her rights. and the property of her citizens. The morning of glory is dawning upon us. The work of liberty has begun. Our actions are to become a part of the history of mankind. Let your valor proclaim to the world that liberty is your birthright. While Houston was asking for outside help, the Texians fired the first shot of the Texan Revolution at Gonzales. Eager volunteers flocked there and sent word to San Felipe that they needed General Austin to command them there on a march to San Antonio. Austin went to the front, and many of the consultation's delegates followed him. San Felipe was in great confusion, as the number of delegates who remained was insufficient for a quorum. Houston immediately went to the front to bring back enough delegates for the consultation. He conferred with General Austin at the Salado River, received a report of the Army's activities, and reviewed the troops. Austin, feeling that he could render more services in other situations than at the head of the Army, urged Houston to take command. Houston declined for the reason that Austin had been elected by the troops, and those who had joined did so with the belief that Austin would be their commander. After a plea from Houston and Austin and the consent of the troops, the delegates returned to San Felipe. While some delegates wanted to declare independence, Houston supported the plea that by forming a separate state government with Mexican Federation, liberal Mexicans would be attracted to the cause. The delegates adopted a provisional decree of independence under the Constitution of 1824 on November 7th. Houston, with the other delegates, signed a declaration of causes explaining their reasons for taking up arms against Mexico while remaining a state. They organized with Henry Smith as governor and Houston as commander-in-chief of the regular army to be recruited for 2 years. He was forbidden to exercise control over the volunteer army, which was formed before the consultation and was now en route to Bihar. This would cause great confusion when Austin resigned and was appointed commissioner to seek aid in the U.S. While Houston was seeking to raise a regular army, the volunteer army engaged in a series of skirmishes, defeated costs in the Siege of Bear, and secured an agreement that the Mexican troops would retreat south of the Rio Grande. The triumphant Texans felt that the war was over, and many returned home. Others organized to march to Matamoros, a move opposed by both Houston and Smith. The General Council attempted to oppose Governor Smith. Houston was now a commander-in-chief without a staff or supplies, and without a clear demarcation between the regulars and the volunteers. When he learned that Colonel James Neal had been left in Bihar with only a few men, Houston wrote Smith, "What will the world think of the authorities of Texas?" In January 1836, Houston left for Goliad. He sent Bowie to Bear with orders to blow up the Alamo and destroy the fort. Houston's actions at Goliad and Refugio reduced the size of the men joining the Matamoros expedition, raised his popularity with the disorganized troops, and assured his election as a delegate from Refugio to the Washington on the Brazos Convention. The council granted him furlough to treat with the Indians. He secured a treaty providing firm peace between the Indians and the provisional government, assuring that the Indians would remain neutral. This action contributed greatly to the Texian victory. Houston reached the convention, deemed that his authority had been superseded by the previous council, and ceased to act as commander-in-chief, asking that a new appointment be made. Texas declared independence. Houston was appointed Major General of the Army of the Republic of Texas, regular, volunteer, and militia, and ordered to take immediate command. On March the 6th, Travis's famous letter arrived by an Alamo courier. Motion was made to adjourn and march to relieve the Alamo. Houston rose and spoke for nearly an hour. He denounced this as madness. We have declared ourselves independent, but we have no organization. There must be a government. The country is in peril. I advise you to sit calmly and firmly and coolly pursue your deliberation. Be wise, be patriotic. Feel no alarm. I pledge myself to proceed at once to Gonzales, where we hear that a small corps of militia have rallied. I will interpose them between this convention and the enemy while you sit in convention. I promise you that the Mexicans will never approach unless they march over my dead body. If mortal power can avail, I will relieve the brave men in the Alamo. He left then, stopping only to rest the horses. That evening, when he put his ear to the ground in Indian fashion, he knew that the last Alamo gun had been fired. At Gonzales, he found less than 400 men who were lacking adequate arms, provisions, and ammunition. His orders to destroy La Bahia and to win Victoria were ignored. Then news of the fate of the Alamo reached Gonzales. Panic ensued, and Houston marched the army eastward toward the Colorado River, with the people following in the runaway scrape. Historians do not agree what actually happened when explosions were heard and Gonzales burned. Houston's son and Lester say that Houston learned that poisoned liquor had been left behind and gave orders to destroy it. The rear guard set fires to the stores without orders from the general, and the liquor barrels exploded, destroying the town. Nor do they agree on the so-called retreat of the Texian army from Gonzales. Some say that the army was first organized there and thus did not come from any other place that they could retreat to. Of the march, Houston wrote Secretary of War Thomas Rusk, "Since we have parted, I have found the darkest hours of my life." His despair grew with the news of Fanning's fate. By March 27th, Houston's army was the only military unit left for Santa Anna to conquer. Rumors circulated that Houston would desert Texas rather than fight. Houston wrote Rusk, "I held no councils of war. If I err, the blame is mine." He offered no explanation as he led the discontented army over the Colorado River to Gross's plantation. Here things improved as they camped for 2 weeks. Houston drilled the troops in military discipline, organized an effective scout and spy system, developed a medical staff, and repaired weapons. The steamboat Yellowstone was available to transport troops across the Brazos. New troops and additional supplies arrived. Houston learned that the Mexican army was smaller than earlier expected. Then Rusk arrived with a letter from Burnett demanding that Houston fight immediately or step down. Rusk listened to Houston's rationalizations, saw for himself the state of the army, and concluded that Houston had acted properly. Russ described in a private conference that he had with Houston, saying few words passed between them. The facts were before them, and they came to but one decision. Houston told Rusk, "We need not talk. You think we ought to fight? I think so too." Rusk said that the fate of Texas was decided upon. The battle was to be fought just as soon as the enemy could be found. On April 14th, the Army crossed the Brazos with its destination a mystery, marching southeast. The road forked. Some of the men demanded of Houston to know if he intended to take the left road to Nacogdoches and the U.S. or the right road to Harrisburg and intercept Santa Ana. Houston declined to answer and immediately was threatened. Here again, historians will always disagree. Marcus James wrote that Houston never intended to fall back to the Sabine. In a later letter to a friend, he amended this a little bit, saying, "I should have given an ampler account of the whole situation." I think Houston had two plans in mind, as he generally did, whatever he was doing. His end was to save Texas, and he was studying all the schemes to that end. But I think the fighting plan was all along he thought he himself would adopt. And certainly most of his preparations were to that end. James goes on to say that he was not influenced in this decision by anything the Houston family said or provided. He further wrote, "Dr. Barker, who certainly isn't prejudiced in Houston's favor, says that there's nothing to show, tangible or otherwise, that Houston contemplated retreating to the Sabine." The report of Houston's retreat was so persistently circulated and never denied that the Mexican army included it in its strategic calculations. Indeed, Santa Anna sent this communique to Filasola. "Due to reports that I have gathered at this point, I have no doubt that General Houston has moved toward Nacogdoches and should have left yesterday in that direction." But on April 16th, cheers swept through the Texas troops when the advance guard marched toward Harrisburg. They had marched 52 miles in 2.5 days. The prairies were quagmired, and the soldiers afterwards reported that whenever a wheel got stuck in the mud, the general would dismount and be among the first to give it a start. He had no tent nor cot, but slept on the wet ground with his troops. On April 18th, Deaf Smith captured a Mexican courier with saddlebags which bore the name of William Travis and contained useful information of Santa Anna's plans. On April 19th, Houston wrote, "This morning we are in preparation to meet Santa Anna. It is the only chance of saving Texas. We will only be about 700, but we go to conquer. It is wisdom growing out of necessity to meet and fight the army now. The troops are in fine spirits, and now is the time for action, though the odds are greatly against us. I leave the results in the hands of an all-wise God. The right for which we fight will be secured, and Texas will be set free." The Texian army camped near the home of Isaac Batterson on the north shore of Buffalo Bayou, which was now 300 yards wide. With a pitifully leaking boat, the only means of transportation across the bayou, Houston faced a serious problem. Batterson had a fine home with probably the only wooden floor in the area, Too old to fight, he donated his floor to the cause, and a raft was hastily constructed. With Houston making the first trip across and Rusk the last, the Texian army crossed the bayou. Lester later quoted Rusk as describing the scene later that evening as Houston made his first speech to the entire army. Now, I take Lester with a grain of salt because he was one of the ones who greatly admired Houston, and sometimes he got carried away. But this passage I use when I talk to the students because it does kind of pique their interest a little bit. The lines were formed. Houston rode up and addressed the soldiers. Those who heard him say that he made the most impassioned and eloquent appeal they ever listened to. The words seemed to flow along the lines like streams of fire. And when he gave them their watchword, "Remember the Alamo," it struck like a bolt of lightning. It was caught up by every man in the army, and one simultaneous shout broke up into the sky. "Remember the Alamo" was repeated, and the green islands of trees in the prairie sent back the echo. This supposedly was a quote from Rusk, and Rusk, who was there when Lester was writing the book, never denied that this was not a true quote. I'm going to interject an opinion here now. It's the only thing that I didn't get from primary sources. I think I can pinpoint the time when Houston finally made his decision and knew the exact battle plan that he was going to use. Houston was a consummate insomniac, getting only 3 hours sleep during this whole campaign, 3 hours sleep a night. On the next night, he had his first full night's sleep of the campaign and gave orders not to be disturbed in the morning. He did not get up with the troops when reveille was called. He did not wake up until the sun shone. He had made a decision. He was not looking back. He had placed his fate and the fate of Texas in the hands of God, and he knew what he was going to do. Rusk wrote in his report of the battle that Houston acted with great gallantry, encouraging the men to attack, and heroically charged in front of the enemy within a few yards, with the infantry within a few yards of the enemy. It was there that Houston received a severe wound in his left ankle and had his horse shot 2 or 3 times. Some eastern newspapers reported that the men who fought at San Jacinto were chiefly volunteers from the states. Kennedy wrote that of the published list that he held in his hand, over 3/4 of the men were Anglo-American settlers. Among the exceptions, he pointed out 19 Mexicans and their captain, Juan Seguin, all native Tejanos. Yoakum wrote, "The writer has before him perhaps 20 accounts of the battle and its incidents. The accounts vary considerably from the fact that no one of the eyewitnesses, however impartial, could himself see a tenth of part of what occurred on the 20th and 21st. Most historians are usually gracious about others using their work. If Arthur Walter Lord, who wrote Time to Stand, were here today, I don't think he would mind my ending my speech for this occasion by paraphrasing his words on another event closer to my home. He wrote, "It is a rash person indeed who claims that he has the final answer to everything that happened on the road to San Jacinto. The best that can be done is to offer some careful conclusions, always subject to correction, that might throw a new light on a few of the many intriguing riddles. Today, I hope I have been able to throw a little light on Sam Houston's intriguing road to San Jacinto. Thank you for your kind attention.
You know, I had heard a lot of good things about Mike Campbell, but it was only later that I learned that he wasn't being constantly outdone by his evil twin, Randolph, who seemed to be responsible for all those books that were getting written. Randolph B. Mike Campbell was educated in Virginia, and I don't know what they taught him there, but he immediately left after getting all of his degrees from the University of Virginia and went to the University of North Texas in 1966, where he has for the most part stayed, creating there a distinguished career, earning a reputation as a superb teacher, producing a number of books about Texas history, especially in the Revolutionary and antebellum period, Wealth and Power in Antebellum Texas, a Southern Community in Crisis, both about Harrison County, Texas, focusing later on agriculture in the antebellum South. One of his books that he's most famous for, An Empire for Slavery, a Peculiar Institution in Texas, the gist of which you will hear today. A wonderful little college biography of Sam Houston, published in the bicentennial year of 1993 for the Library of American Biography. His grassroots reconstruction in Texas, talking about all those scalawags that some people didn't think existed. And then two new books that are coming out this year. Mike editing for the Southern Methodist University's Library of Texas series, the Frederick Olmsted Journey Through Texas, or a Saddle Trip in the Southwestern Frontier, one of the most enlightening observations of Texas in the 1850s. And then this book, published by Oxford University Press. This is the uncorrected advanced reading copy. I checked The Death of Davy Crockett, and he has a couple of changes he needs to make in that. This book should be published by August of 2003 with a few changes by Oxford University Press. I'm immediately passing this off to Kent Biffle, and you will read about it in the Dallas Morning News. That's the only copy in existence. That's why we keep passing it back and forth. But without further ado, I would like to give you Randolph and Mike Campbell.
Jim's upset because I said possibly Davy Crockett was one of those who surrendered and was executed. I thought possibly was a perfectly good weasel word for
It's a good word, but not the S word.
for a historian to use. Also, if Jim hadn't told you that I'm from Virginia, once I talked for a few minutes and said out or about, you would say, Texas, and you'd be right. Yesterday, when I was speaking to Greystone Television, after I talked for a couple of minutes, they came up and changed the microphone, and they said, "This is a Virginia filter." And you'll sound just like everyone else. And I thought at first they were teasing me, and they insisted they weren't. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that comes out. My subject today is slavery in the Texas Revolution. Do we have the? Is it? Oops. Can you see this? There we go. This is Benjamin Lundy. Benjamin Lundy was a noted American abolitionist who traveled widely in Mexican Texas between 1830 and 1835, and he had no doubts concerning the role of slavery as a cause of the Texas Revolution. and therefore ultimately of the Battle of San Jacinto. In his 1837 book entitled The War in Texas, Lundy wrote, "It is susceptible of the clearest demonstration that the immediate cause and leading object of the contest originated in a settled design among the slaveholders of this country, with land speculators and slave traders, to wrest the large and valuable territory of Texas from the Mexican Republic in order to reestablish the system of slavery, to open a vast and profitable slave market therein, and ultimately to annex it to the United States." Jose Maria Thornall, a Mexican anti-slavery leader, said essentially the same thing the next year. Quote, "The land speculators of Texas have tried to convert it into a mart of human flesh, where the slaves of the South might be sold and others from Africa might be introduced." A British abolitionist named John Scobell put the same charge in more colorful language a few years later. The quote-unquote robber state called Texas, he wrote, was settled by, quote, "hordes of characterless villains whose sole object has been to reestablish slavery and the slave trade." Now, circumstantial evidence seems to support the claims of Lundy, Thornall, and Scobell concerning slavery as a cause of the Revolution. A look at the period from late 1821, when Anglos began settling in Texas in large numbers, and 1835, when the Revolution began, reveals that the settlers from the United States were always concerned about establishing and maintaining slavery in Texas. A look at those years also shows that the federal government of Mexico and the state government of Coahuila in Texas periodically offered opposition to slavery that, although never decisive, bothered many Anglo immigrants and probably held down the number of slaves brought in from the United States. And let me establish here as a reference point that Texas in 1836 had about 5,000 slaves in a total population, excluding Indians, of about 38,500. This means that slaves amounted to approximately 13% of the total population at the time of the Revolution, and I'll come back to that. So the argument based on circumstantial evidence seems strong. Before accepting it, however, we need to examine in some detail how Anglos brought their brand of slavery to Texas, how the federal and state governments in Mexico opposed it, and what effect that opposition had on the growth of the peculiar institution, as Southerners call it. Then we'll be in a position to look for direct evidence on the role of slavery in the Revolution and evaluate exactly where it stood, slavery stood, before, during, and after the conflict of 1835-1836. Now, there were a few slaves in Texas while it was still a Spanish province. A 1790 census, for example, counted 43 slaves in settlements north of the Rio Grande. But slavery did not really become an institution of significance here until the arrival of Anglo-American settlers. Between 1810 and 1820, people from the United States, some of whom held slaves, began to drift into the area of East Texas between Nacogdoches and the Louisiana border. In 1816, other Americans, also including a few slaveholders, began to settle in North Texas at Pecan Point in present-day Red River County. Now, these early settlers had no legal right to be in Texas and certainly no assurances that they could hold slaves there. In the 1820s, however, Anglo-Americans would pour into Texas, and no rule or regulation would deny them their slaves. Now, as you know, Moses Austin opened the way for legal settlement by Anglo-Americans in Texas when he went to San Antonio and received a grant from Spanish authorities in 1821 to settle a colony on the lower Brazos and Colorado rivers. Now, fittingly enough, he was accompanied on this trip by a slave, a man named Richmond, who belonged to Moses Austin's son, Stephen F. Austin. Now, also, as you know, Moses Austin died later in 1821, whereupon Stephen F. Austin went to San Antonio and had himself confirmed as heir to his father's grant. In the process, he convinced Spanish authorities to allow him, by the terms of his original contract, to grant 80 acres of land to slaveholders for every slave brought into the colony. Clearly then, slavery had an important place in early plans for Anglo-Texas. Then, just as Austin prepared to settle his colony, events in Spanish America cast a cloud over the future of slavery in Texas. And that was, of course, because Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, and that raised questions about slavery because Mexican revolutionaries, including both Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos, always voiced strong opposition to the institution. For the next 15 years, from the beginning of settlement in Austin's colony at the end of 1821 until the conclusion of the Revolution in 1836, slavery grew in Texas, but its place was uncertain and insecure. Most of the settlers in Austin's colony were from the southern United States, where slavery was commonplace, and some brought slaves with them. The majority who owned slaves, brought slaves, held only a few, but some brought enough to build plantations immediately. For example, Jared Gross arrived from Alabama in 1822 with 90 slaves and set up a cotton plantation on the Brazos River. Slavery was important enough from the beginning of Austin's colony that the set of civil and criminal regulations that he promulgated in 1824 contained a number of rules intended to protect the institution. Slavery couldn't live without laws to support it. Austin provided those laws in 1824. For example, any white person who found a slave away from home without a pass was to give the bondsman 10 lashes and see to it that he was returned to his owner. The first census of Austin's colony in 1825 showed 443 slaves and a total population of 1,800, and the institution continued to grow. Early Anglo settlers argued that slavery was a practical necessity in Texas, that the only way the state could be settled and develop rapidly was by employing slave labor. Stephen F. Austin, a slaveholder himself, expressed this point of view clearly in an 1825 letter to the governor of the new state of Coahuila in Texas, telling him that without slavery, Texas could not attract the people to make it a thriving land of cotton and sugar plantations, but would instead be a province populated by shepherds and the poor. So the motivation of early Texas slaveholders was primarily economic, although they had few, if any, qualms about slavery as a socially and morally correct institution either. Moreover, as was true across the Old South, the great majority of non-slaveholders, people who didn't own slaves, supported the institution, even though they weren't involved in it. They supported the institution partly because of racial solidarity and partly because of the hope that they could become slaveholders in the future. So the earliest Anglo settlers generally wanted slavery in Texas. That seems very clear. Throughout the years, from 1823 until 1836, however, Mexican authorities regularly threatened to limit or abolish slavery. Now, I don't have time to go into all of these threats, so as examples, let me cite only two that I think are the best known. The first came in 1827, when the new constitution of the state of Coahuila in Texas prohibited the further introduction of slaves into the state and declared that all children born thereafter to slaves already in the state would be free at birth. Now, Anglo-American settlers were very alarmed, since this would have prohibited slavery, but within a year, the Congress of the state of Coahuila in Texas, apparently impressed by the claims of Austin's colonists that they had no other way to obtain labor, issued a decree that allowed slaves to be brought in as indentured servants. Before being brought to Texas, slaves signed contracts with their masters by which they were made free, but in return for their quote-unquote freedom, agreed that they and their children after them would become servants to the master for 99 years. Some of you women will like this. One of the indentures I read, the women were indentured for 99 years to learn the, quote, art and mystery of cooking and cleaning. Seriously. So, okay, I'll stop there. The price, you see the price for freedom was perpetual servitude, and you see the point. The state government took a stand against slavery and then allowed settlers in Texas, Anglo settlers in Texas, a loophole to slip through and keep their bondsmen. The second example came in September of 1829, when President Vicente Guerrero issued a decree declaring immediate emancipation everywhere in the Mexican Republic. Again, however, Texans kept slavery thanks to quick action on the part of Ramon Musquiz, the political chief at San Antonio. Musquiz appealed for and secured an exemption for Texas from the decree on the grounds that settlers there had been promised security for their property and that they could not develop the province economically, quote, without the aid of the robust and almost indefatigable arms of that race of the human species which is called Negroes, and who to their misfortune suffer slavery. So, as these two cases demonstrate, throughout the years before the Revolution, Mexican authorities periodically took a stand against slavery and then allowed settlers in Texas a loophole or an exception. A traveler in 1835 summarized the result of this approach as follows. This is a quote. By the laws, slavery is not allowed in this province, but this law is evaded by binding the Negroes by indenture for a term of years. You will therefore find Negro servants more or less all over the country, but more on the lowlands toward the bays and seacoast. Large cotton plantations in this section of the country are cultivated by Negroes. Now, actually, he was wrong on the first part. Slavery was not absolutely outlawed. Slaves brought in before 1827 were not affected by the state constitution. And what settlers did was just simply blur the distinction between slaves and indentured servants and treat them all as slaves. During the late 1820s and early 1830s, slaves/servants in Texas were bought and sold, hired out, listed as property assets in estate inventories, and bequeathed in wills. Stephen F. Austin, for example, bought a slave woman named Mary at San Felipe in February 1828, and William Barrett Travis sold a 5-year-old boy for $225 on Christmas Day, 1834, warranting that he, Travis, had, quote, a clear right and title to the boy. Austin's will, written in 1833, specified that a slave woman named Mary, presumably the one bought in 1828, was to go as a bequest to the wife of Samuel May Williams, his business partner. Clearly then, official Mexican opposition did not prevent the establishment of slavery in Texas and practicing the institution much as it was practiced in the Old South. However, even the government's limited and vacillating resistance probably retarded the growth of slavery in the province. Juan Almonte, on his inspection tour in 1834, estimated the slave population at 2,000. Henry Morfitt, an envoy sent to Texas by Andrew Jackson in 1836, estimated the total to be 5,000. The first official count of any kind came in 1837, when tax assessor collectors compiled the state's first tax rolls county by county. Remember, slaves were personal property, so they were counted and assessed and taxed as property. And as long as Texas had slavery, you can get a year-by-year count of the slaves across the state in county tax rolls. Well, tax rolls were compiled the first time in 1837. Texas had 25 counties in 1837, and tax rolls are available for 13 of them. I drew that, that's why it's so pretty, but anyway. Now, in those 13 counties, you can count that, I promise you I'm right, because I used a calculator. There are 3,527 slaves. Now, if you look at this and you know Texas, you're aware that a number of counties that had sizable numbers of slaves didn't report that year. As for example, here's Matagorda County, Red River County, Liberty, Austin, and Montgomery. I know from another source that Liberty and Austin together had 685 slaves in 1837, not from the tax rolls, but from another count. So my point is that the 1837 total that you can see here is definitely an undercount, and the estimate of 5,000 in 1836 was a very reasonable approximation. Now, those 5,000 slaves in the area in 1836 amounted to about 13% of the total population, as I said a minute ago, and I think that's probably a good good many fewer in number and a smaller percentage of the total than they would have been under more favorable circumstances where the government was concerned. Now, I reached this conclusion primarily because of how fast slavery grew after 1837. From this, in 1837, estimated 5,000, the slave population rose to this by 1845. Look at those numbers. This is Brazoria County with over 2,000. This is Harrison County, Red River County. Matagorda County had more than 1,000 slaves. This population is more than 27,500 at the time, approximately the time Texas joined the Union. When the first United States Census was taken in Texas in 1850, as you can see here, the count went to 58,161. That's about 27% of the state's total population. And then during the next 10 years, the slave population continued to grow faster and then the free. By 1860, there were, as you can see, 182,566 bondsmen in the state. That's about 30% of the total population. Texas still did not have slaves in sheer numbers to match a state like Virginia, but it was the fastest slave-growing state in the Union on the eve of the Civil War, and slaves were as large a proportion, just about as large a proportion of the population of Texas as they were the population of Virginia. When I came to Texas, people told me slavery wasn't very important here, and I was curious about that, and I don't believe that's true at all. I think slavery, either slavery wasn't important in Virginia, which nobody would argue, or it was important here, because proportionally it was just as strong. Now, to come back to the main point, slavery had a foothold in Texas by 1835-36, but its future remained uncertain as long as the province remained part of Mexico. And you see then that brings us back to the claim by Lundy, Thornall, and the others that the desire to protect and promote slavery was a major cause of the Revolution, and it makes it seem plausible. Problems appear for this interpretation, however, when you look for direct evidence rather than circumstantial evidence. When you look for direct evidence to prove that slavery played a major role in bringing on the revolt. I don't have time to review all the events and developments between 1830 and 1835 that led to conflict. They've been reviewed to some extent today. But I am confident in saying that slavery was not the key to anything that happened from the passage of the law of April 6, 1830, which signaled the beginning of significant trouble, until the outbreak of fighting at Gonzales in 1835. If you've been listening carefully to the things that people have said today, none of them have brought up slavery as an issue in that period. Now, during that time, the state of Coahuila in Texas passed a law in 1832 that limited the duration of labor contracts to 10 years. But the eventual enforcement of that rule, like all other rules, was uncertain. During this time, the federal government of Mexico took no action threatening slavery directly or immediately, and Anglos in Texas didn't claim that threats to the peculiar institution were a major concern at this time. Instead, the immediate cause of conflict was the imposition of a centralist regime by Santa Anna in Mexico and the implications of centralism for Texas. Now, you remember the early problems over Mexican tariffs and other rules led Texans to call conventions at San Felipe in 1832 and 1833 and asked to be made a separate state in the Mexican Federation. And then, of course, in 1835, Santa Anna abolished the federal system altogether. Now granted, the desire of Texans to form a separate state would have increased their chances of providing security for slavery, and everybody knew that. Federal system meant more local control. That gave Texans a better chance to protect slavery. That was clear. But slavery received no special attention, no special mention at the conventions of 1832 and 1833. Mexico forced the issue in 1835, not over slavery, but over customs duties and the generally defiant attitude of Anglo-Americans in Texas, and the result was revolution. Now, my next point is this. In arguing that slavery was not an immediate cause of the revolution or the cause of the revolution, I don't intend to say that it had no importance in the conflict. The conflict resulted at least in part from the fact that important residents of Texas, Anglo-Texians and Tejanos alike, thought that the government in faraway Mexico City didn't appreciate their needs. And it resulted in part from a clash of cultural traditions. Anglo-Americans, Mexican-Americans were different in many ways, language and religion, for example, and slavery was another one of those differences. The various attacks on slavery by the federal and state governments that I've mentioned, and the reactions by settlers of the United States made that clear. So slavery was there, but it was in the background. And I think still best described by Eugene C. Barker. I'm glad to see some other people approving Barker today. Best described by Barker as, quote, a dull organic ache. Slavery can be considered one of the underlying causes of the revolution that created the Republic of Texas, but it was not a major immediate cause. Certainly it was not the cause. Now, even though slavery was not a major cause of the revolution or the cause, once conflict began to develop in the summer and fall of 1835, Anglo-Texans certainly worried a great deal about what the revolution would mean for slavery. Some of them expressed concern that Mexico would use the crisis, in the words of Robert M. Williamson, to compel you to liberate your slaves. There was an even greater fear that Mexican forces would encourage the slaves, once they were free, to rise up against their former masters. On July 5th, 1835, Ben Milam wrote Frank Johnson that the Mexicans' quote, intention is to gain the friendship of the different tribes of Indians and, if possible, to get the slaves to revolt. Another Texian returning from Mexico later in the summer of 1835 reported that the Mexican army planned to liberate the slaves and, quote, let them loose upon our families. Now, in reality, these fears were largely unfounded. Even when Santa Anna did bring an army into Texas in 1836, he had no clear policy regarding slaves and no plan to use them against their masters. That was reality, and as I'm sure you know, reality is a lot less important than what people think is real. And as the revolution began, many Anglo-Texans certainly believed that Mexican forces meant to try to use their slaves against them and create, in the words of Ben Milam again, a situation for whites, quote, worse than that of the most degraded slave. You know, slaveholders at the time of the American Revolution and at the time of the Texas Revolution, slaveholders never appreciated the irony of casting their struggle as a fight for liberty against slavery, all the while holding slaves. Now, the fear of revolt was heightened in October of 1835. At about the same time fighting began between Texan and Mexican forces. On October 17th, a settler named B.J. White wrote Stephen F. Austin, I have some unpleasant news to communicate. The Negroes on Brazos made an attempt to rise. Near 100 have been taken up, many whipped nearly to death, some hung, etc. White added in a postscript that the plotters had planned to divide the cotton farms, make the whites work for them, and ship cotton to New Orleans. Now, there's no evidence that the possibility of war and an invasion by Mexican armies encouraged this plot, and to whatever extent it was planned, it was put down quickly and decisively. Nevertheless, it increased slaveholders' fears about what might happen during the impending revolutionary conflict. The arrival of Mexican armies in early 1836, the fall of the Alamo, the ensuing pursuit of Sam Houston's army as it retreated eastward, and the runaway scrape did not bring what slaveholders feared the most, that is, a slave uprising. But these events certainly created major disruptions in slavery in Texas. First, some slaves took advantage of the situation to run away. General Jose Urrea, the very capable cavalry commander we've heard quite a bit about already today, Urrea recorded on April 3rd, quote, 14 Negro slaves with their families came to me on this day, and I sent them free to Victoria. And he meant Victoria and Tamaulipas. Anne Ranny Coleman said that 4 of her husband's slaves ran away to the Mexican army, leaving him, quote, inconsolable at his loss. After San Jacinto, 13 slaves left Matagorda with the retreating Mexicans, apparently helping themselves to some of their master's property as they went. Now, some of the runaways aided the Mexican army by carrying messages and helping at river crossings. The number of runaways cannot be determined, but there were enough that the treaties of Velasco after the Revolution call for the return of, quote, Negro slaves or indentured persons, unquote, who had been captured or had taken refuge with the Mexicans. General Vicente Filasola attempted to comply with this requirement, but General Urrea and several other officers bitterly opposed him. Urrea wrote later, "All the slaves within my jurisdiction continued to enjoy their liberty." Now, slaves who either chose not to run away or had no opportunity to run away still found their lives drastically affected by the war. For example, they had to suffer the hardships of the runaway scrape with their owners, in some cases traveling all the way to Louisiana. Some slaves were hired to work for the Texan Army. A large group were drafted to build fortifications at Galveston. Virtually all of them saw the normal routines and control mechanisms of bondage upset. As late as November 1836, the Columbia Telegraph and Texas Register carried an advertisement placed by a group of owners asking for the return of, quote, a number of African Negroes, unquote, who were, quote, wandering around the country along the Colorado River. Now, of course, not all slaves wanted to use the opportunity provided by the war to run away or to take advantage of looser controls. Some slaves loyally supported their owners on the Texian side in the conflict. They aided in the flight of Anglo families to the east, served as messengers, and brought provisions to the Texian army. For example, a teamster named Peter, who belonged to the revolutionary leader Wiley Martin, voluntarily provided such valuable service in transporting supplies that his actions were cited as a key part of the justification when the legislature was asked to permit his manumission in 1839. We'll get to this, but for a slave to be freed in Texas and stay in Texas required the approval of the Congress at this point. Well, Peter's revolutionary services were cited. He was given his freedom in 1842, and he lived in the town of Richmond in Fort Bend County until his death in 1863. This is the kind of thing I like when you tell these sorts of stories. I love documentation. If you look at this, you see here's Peter Martin. This is the United States Census of 1860. Here's Peter Martin, 59-year-old, and somebody, I guess this was unusual enough, you see the census taker drew a line under it? And this is the column for color, which isn't even filled in other cases, because they're all white. And he's listed as a black cook, and he owns real estate worth $1,200. He, by the way, had enough money to hire his wife, who was a slave. He hired her from her master so that his family could be together. And I don't want y'all to pursue the idea of a wife as a slave any further. Then another slave, a man named Carey, who belonged to Thomas F. McKinney, also won recognition and eventual manumission for his services as a messenger. Now, these cases aren't typical, of course not. Most slaves who remained loyal also remained in servitude. A really interesting case of a loyal slave with a nice twist at the end is the story of Joe, William Barry Travis's slave, who's generally called the only male survivor of the Alamo. I'll probably get in trouble for that, so I said generally. Joe claimed that he armed himself and fired several times at the attackers, but then after Travis's death, he retreated and hid in one of the Alamo buildings. At the close of the battle, he obeyed a Mexican command to surrender, and thanks to an officer, was spared death. Supposedly, Santa Anna himself questioned Joe about Texas and its army, and then he was allowed to accompany Susanna Dickinson to Sam Houston's camp at Gonzales. Then he was later questioned by cabinet officers of the government of the new Republic of Texas. That was on March 20th, and then sent to Travis's home at Columbia, where he remained a slave. But on April 21st, 1837, it's a day that was chosen probably not entirely by accident, Joe and an unidentified Mexican man took 2 horses and ran away. A notice offering $50 for his return ran in the Houston newspaper for 3 months before being discontinued. I have no idea whether he knew about April 21st or not, but April 21, 1837, he ran away. Apparently, he took and kept the freedom that his service to Travis had not won for him up to that point. So the Revolution threatened and it disrupted slavery in many ways. But it also gave white Texans an opportunity to give the institution the constitutional and legal protections necessary to secure its future here. Now, if you look at Section 9 of the general provisions of the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, written and adopted in March 1836, you'll find this: all persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude. And I won't read all of it to you. You can see what it does is assure slavery, and the last part is about free blacks not staying in Texas without the approval of Congress. It also outlawed the African slave trade. The charge that Thornall and others made about the African slave trade really was unfounded, I think. And the Texas Constitution, while it protected slavery, it prohibited the international or African slave trade. Now, if you read this, you can see the intent of this constitutional section is crystal clear. As Judge Abner S. Lipscomb of the Supreme Court of Texas wrote in a decision 15 years later, it was manifestly the intention of the convention in framing this provision to remove all doubt and uneasiness among the citizens of Texas in regard to the tenure by which they held dominion over their slaves. Thus, protecting slavery was not the primary cause of the Texas Revolution, but security for slavery certainly was one result of it. Now, as a concluding point, the whole Constitution of the Republic, these protections for slavery included, obviously would have meant nothing had Santa Anna crushed the revolt in Texas. Almost certainly one reprisal taken by the government in Mexico City on Anglo-Texians, had the Anglo-Texians lost, would have been the elimination of slavery. Indeed, when the government of Mexico finally abolished slavery, quote, without any exception, unquote, throughout the Republic of Mexico on April 5th, 1837, it promised to indemnify all slave owners. Surely there weren't many, but it promised to indemnify all slave owners except for Texas colonists, quote, who took part in the rebellion of that department. Therefore, the victory at San Jacinto on April 21st, 1836, while securing the freedom of Anglo-Texans from Mexico, also secured the chains on their black slaves. History does have its ironies, doesn't it?